Peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 2 of the Butterick 5209 sew along. So today we are going to be sewing up our bodice. So let's get started. So as you know, I'm making view B, which is the view with the back on it. So the first thing it wants us to do is gather lower edge of bodice front between small circles. So I haven't marked in any of my notches or markings as yet, so I'm going to do that first, but the first sewing step will be to gather between the small circles. So I'm going to mark them in. Okay, so I've clipped into all of my notches so that I know where all of them are. Now for the circles, what I like to do is this circle down here is meant to be 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge. Because I've lengthened the bottom of this by an inch, I've just put the circle in kind of underneath that one, but it does need to be 5/8 of an inch away from the edge. So what I like to do is put a pin through the next marking and then peel back the layers and make a mark on the fabric where the point of the pin has, or where the pin has gone through. I'm using a friction pen, which is a pen that comes away when you apply heat. Whichever type of marking tool you use, you want to make sure that it will come off of your fabric, so practice on a scrap before you start putting on markings, just in case, because sometimes friction pens leave a white residue, which is not what you want. And it wouldn't matter so much for these ones because they are on the inside of the garment, but if it was you had to make a mark anywhere else, you want to make sure that it will come off. So I'm going to go around and I'm going to do the same thing. So we've got these small circles which indicate the portion that they would like you to gather. Then we've got this square and large circle here which we need to mark in. There is a large circle over in the corner there, and then there's another large circle at the top of the collar as well. So I'm going to mark all of those in exactly the same way by putting a pin through them, peeling back the layers and using my friction pen to make a mark on the fabric. Okay, so I have run my gathering stitches between the two small circles on the bottom of the front bodice, and I have done one line of stitching at 3/8 of an inch and then another line of stitching 3/8 of an inch away from that. So the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance is actually between those two lines of stitching. I've got my stitch length on a 5. You want to go as big as your machine will let you. This is my preferred method of gathering because I find that I get the nicest gathers if there's gathers to either side of where I'm stitching. The only proviso with that is you want to double check again on a scrap of fabric that your fabric will recover from having stitches removed from it, so that you don't end up with noticeable holes. This rayon is very forgiving. For a silk, for example, you might want to again test before you actually stitch on your garment so that you don't end up damaging the fabric and it have any visible holes left, because this line of stitching here is actually inside of the garment itself and will be seen, or this fabric will be seen, so we're going to need to remove this line of stitching. This entire bodice is self-lined, so we need to make 2 of them. So everything that we do, we need to do for the outer and the lining. So we've got 4 front bodices that need gathering, so I'm going to do that for the rest of the pieces. Okay, so the next thing it wants us to do is stay stitch the edge of the 2 front midriff sections. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that for all 4 because, as I say, we're having to make this bodice twice because one is for the outside and one is for the lining. So I'm going to stay stitch the upper edge of both of the lining and the outer bodice. Then I'm going to pin midriff front to lower edge of bodice, adjust the gathers, stitch and stitch again 1/4 of an inch away in the seam allowance, trim close to seam allowance and then press the seam towards the midriff. Okay, so I have sewn the upper bodice to the midriff and I have done another line of stitching 1/4 of an inch away from the 5/8 of an inch seam line, and I'm now going to trim off the excess. And once we've trimmed that, we're going to press the seam down towards the midriff, and I'm going to be careful because I've still got my marks here that I need and they will disappear with heat if I'm not careful. So I'm going to trim off this excess seam allowance. I'm going to repeat that step for the other 3 front bodice pieces. Okay, so I've finished this and I've pressed my seam towards the midriff. So I'm moving on to step 17, which is stitch bodice front sections together at centre back 2 large circles as shown. So again, we're doing that to both of our pieces, and I have got them pinned right sides together, and we're going to be sewing to the large circle and back stitching there. Okay, so the next step is to stay stitch the armhole edges of bodice from the front edge right to the small circle. So I have done that, and again I've done that on the outer and the inner. So the next step is to stay stitch neck edge of bodice back, and we're going to do that for the outside fabric and for the lining. Once we've stay stitched the neckline, we need to move on to the back midriff. So we're going to sew the two midriff sections together at the centre back, which is the shorter of the two seams, and you're going to sew it up to the square that you've just marked. Okay, so the next thing it wants us to do is pin midriff back to lower edge of bodice back, matching centres, stitch pivoting at the square. So there is a square at the lower back of the back bodice. We've sewn up to the square on the midriff, which is that step that we have just done. I have pressed my midriff seam open. I've done that for both the lining and the outer fabric. So I'm going to pin this in place and stitch at 5/8 of an inch. When sewing a seam like this, I find it easier to pin in one section and sew to the pivot point and back stitch, and then maneuver everything around so that everything lies flat on this side, which is what we're after, and then start at the pivot point, back stitch, and then sew the other seam. So that's what I've done here. I've not pressed it yet, but you should end up with something that looks like this, and we're going to press the seam allowance down towards the midriff. So the next thing that we need to do is sew on our sleeves. So we're going to stitch one sleeve section to bodice back at each shoulder, and again we're going to be doing this for the outer fabric and the lining. So the next thing he wants us to do is pin bodice back and sleeves to bodice front, clipping where necessary, stitch, clip back neck seam. So we're pinning in around this area here, around all the areas that we stay stitched. So we stay stitched the front of the bodice around these armholes, and then the back neckline around here. Now I haven't had to clip mine because my fabric is very forgiving, but I have pinned it all into place. If you do need to clip into it, you just want to clip up to but not through your stay stitching. This is the front armhole here, and you want to make sure that you've pinned it so that you have this is the front bodice here, but this is the back neckline of it. So we've got the curvy bit free floating, and then the other side is the neckline that we're stitching into place. So I'm going to stitch that at 5/8 of an inch. It's asking us to clip into the back neck seam, and that's just so that we can get the curve to lie nice and flatly. So I've done that. If we look at this, doesn't say much about pressing in this pattern, but if we look at the next picture, you can see that that seam that we've just sewn has been pressed open, so I'm going to do that now. It then says under step 23, prepare and stitch lining sections together in the same manner as bodice, but we've been doing everything in sync as we've been going along. So you should have an outer and a bodice that we can very shortly stitch together. So I'm going to go press my seams that I've just sewn open, and then we can stitch our bodice together. So the next thing I wanted us to do was turn in seam allowance of lower edges of lining and press, and I have done that whilst I was pressing the neck seams open. Now if you are working with a print like I am, and when you're looking at your pieces, if you find pieces that you prefer the print placement of, I've stuck pins into them so that I know that these are the outside pieces. So all of the pieces that I've sewn together here are my preferred pattern placement, and the lining pieces I have got no pins in. So now I can identify it because I've pressed up the lower edge, but up until that point they looked identical. So yes, if you want to differentiate between your lining and your outer, and because you have preferred print placement, then stick a pin in your outer fabrics. Okay, so the next thing it wants us to do is, with right sides together, pin lining to bodice, matching seams, stitch neck edge between large circles, pivoting at centre back, as shown, trim. So we're going to be sewing from the large circle at the front all the way around, and there is a large circle at the back that we need to pivot at. So I'm going to pin all that in place and show you what it looks like. So I've stitched from my large circle, which is at the centre front, all the way around my neckline, and I have come down to the large circle where we have stitched our back collars together. If you're worried about this curved seam allowance, you can always draw in your stitching line to give yourself a guide. And once I had pivoted there, I've then gone round and again come all the way down to the large circle at the centre front, if I can find it, on the other side. So yeah, large circle there. So the next thing it wants us to do is to trim the seam allowance, and then it wants us to stitch sleeve edges between large circles, trim and understitch lining as far as possible. Now if we go on to the next picture, there's only understitching around the neckline. There's no understitching visible around the armholes. So I'm going to understitch my neckline, then I'm going to trim, then I'm going to press it. So I'm understitching the part which joins the front bodice to the lining bodice, and I've got all the seam allowance pressed towards the line. Well, I've got all the seam allowance finger pressed towards the lining. We want to be stitching 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. So when you're going around, you want to be kind of holding this taut so that nothing gets too caught up or bunched up under your stitching. I like to understitch before I press because the understitching will help me press later. I'm also doing this step now before I've sewn the sleeve seams together because it's much easier to maneuver. And we're not going to be able to get all the way around this because there's a curved collar, so you want to get as close as you can to the collar and stop, then move past the collar and then start again. And again, we've sewn to the large circles, so again we want to leave a little bit, so half an inch. We want to finish our understitching half an inch before that large circle because again we're going to be attaching our front seam together at that large circle, so we need to have that accessible. So I'm going to continue understitching and then I can press. And I think you can just about see my line of understitching here. So like I said, about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line, and it's just got all of the seam allowances captured in that understitching, and that will help the lining stay on the inside. So I'm going to trim this seam that I've just sewn, especially around the collar point at the back, or the collar curve at the back, so that I can push it through and it will curve nicely. Stitch sleeve edges between large circles, trim understitch lining as far as possible. Again, I don't think they mean us to understitch the sleeve edges because there's no understitch shown there, it's just shown here, and it's so much easier to do this before you sew up the sleeve edges. So I have got my sleeves pinned from my large circle at the front, matched up my notches, matched up my shoulder seam, and got pinned down to my large circle at the back. So basically midriff to midriff, and we're going to sew that at 5/8 of an inch, and you're going to do that for both sides. Now we get to do the fun bit and turn the lining to the inside, and then we can press all of our edges. So you just want to reach through and carefully, because you've got pins in it if you are marking the outside fabric with pins, reach through and pull the bodice the right way out, very gently, all the way through. Okay, so we're now going to go and press the sleeves and the neckline edge, and we're going to press that so it's nice and flat all the way around. The next step is to open out the lining, pin fronts together at centre front, pin lining edges together, and stitch breaking stitching at large circle. Kind of like you butterfly the thing. So this is the front, this is the lining. You remember we stitched to that large circle beforehand, so what I've done is I've pinned my lining up. I've pinned my front together, matched up my notches, matched up my midriff panel so that hopefully we'll get a nice V there. And I'm going to stitch up to the large circle here, back stitch. Then I'm going to start again, and I'm going to move all of the seam allowance out of the way, and again start at the large circle and then sew this side, the lining side, together. Again, we're going to back stitch at the large circle and at the end of our stitching line. In the diagram they show that the lining is being stitched together with the seam allowance pressed up so that the seam allowance is being caught. I personally don't like the finish that that gives, so I have folded out my pressed edge. I'm going to stitch across that, and then I'm going to press it up again once I'm done. I prefer how that looks. Next step is to sew back neck seams together loosely by hand. So you want to reach up through the back of the dress and you want to get to the back neckline. So I've got mine pinned together here, and I'm going to sew it very loosely together, and that's just to help again the lining stay inside and not to roll out. Okay, next we are stitching up the right hand side seam in the same manner as we did the front seam. So pin front to back at right side, pin lining edges together, stitch breaking stitching at large circle. So we're going to stitch from the hem up to the large circle with all the seam allowance towards the lining. Then we're going to back stitch there. We're going to move our seam allowance to the other side, start stitching at the large circle and down to the hem. And again, they've illustrated that the hem of the lining is sewn together with it pressed back. Again, I don't like that finish, so I'm going to sew mine together right to the hem and then press it back once it's sewn together. Then it simply says turn lining down. So I've done that, and I've also put it on my mannequin whilst I work on the skirt. have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!